Oh, just let me
That clock keeps ticking like a metronome, and my thoughts keep telling me to get me home, but my balls keep telling me to let me just let me
Welcome to part 2 of a 3-part review series of the Parnis Explorer. In this part, the design review, I'll be talking about the watch in a lot more detail after having owned it for over 3 weeks. I'll break down some of the things I've noticed, compare its design to its Rolex counterpart, and give you a better overall general impression about how the watch has been wearing and how I've enjoyed it. If you haven't seen part 1, the initial impressions, in that video I talk more about the watch after owning it over 24 hours. It's a much rougher guide to what the watch is like, and the watch itself was in a standard configuration. Since then I've modified the watch, which I'll talk about at a later stage. So if you'd like to see that part, I would suggest you see that before you watch this episode, so I'll link it in the description. But all that being said, let's get into the video. I mean, just look at this watch. It really has taken me for a few reasons. And the one word I'll use to describe this watch is its versatility, because it is so versatile. A sporty dress watch in its purest form. I found myself gravitating to wearing this watch a lot more than I thought I would, simply because of just how easy it is to read. It's so legible, it's so easy to wear, especially equipped with the Jubilee bracelet. And I will talk about the modifications that I've made to the watch at a later stage. But before we go into all of that, let's just talk about the general specifications and the dimensions of the watch overall. So breaking down the specs, we have a 40mm case diameter, 31mm dial diameter. We have a lug-to-lug width of 20mm. We have a lug height, lug-to-lug end of 48mm, and a case height overall, including the stepped sapphire crystal and the case back, of 13mm. Now, the mistake I made in the first part of the review is that I likened this case design to the Datejust 40mm Datejust style case, with entirely polished lugs and polished center links on the Oyster bracelet. I didn't realize that this case was actually designed around the Milgauss case. If you know anything about the Milgauss, generally those cases are a bit beefier because of its anti-magnetic resistant properties. So that was a bit of a mistake on my end. This case is in fact designed around the Milgauss style case, which is why it looks quite bulky and quite beefy in its overall size. And if I just compare it to the Oyster style case, which is on the GMT, you can see the Oyster style case is a lot flatter in presence. Whereas this case has a bulbous nature to it, it's a bit rounded. I prefer this style of case. I think it's a little bit more complex and it makes the finishing look a lot more interesting to the eye, so that's something. But this case size by no means gets in the way of the eye when you're wearing it, so I'll talk about that as well when I get into the wearability side of things. Now this watch did come, as I said, with polished lugs, which I have since brushed out. If we look at the dial, it is a flat matte dial with a sapphire crystal that I've said already is stepped and it's raised off the case. It is a beautiful dial overall. The numerals, indices are well spaced, well put into the case. We look at the hands, everything is well set, the height, everything's accurate. All these little prints around the dial, all that minute track has been well situated. And I think there's been something done to this that has improved it over the Rolex original, the 214-270 design, which I will show at a later stage. But let's get into talking about the bracelet, because this bracelet, as I'm sure you're aware, did not come standard with this watch. The standard style bracelet is your Oyster style bracelet. Now this came with polished center links. I wore it for a short period of time. If you haven't seen me wearing it, then in the initial impressions, I wear the watch just as it comes out of the package. The complaints I have with these first generation bracelets are all the same. That being that the tolerances aren't very well sought after. They can be quite finicky. As you can see, there are gaps between the mid links and the side links. This one especially is pretty horrible over here. They have since improved that with their second generation bracelets, which I will talk about. But the one gripe I really had is the way that the end link connects to the first link of the bracelet. You can see that there is a big jump, there is a big extension, and the center part of the link doesn't curve around as much as you'd like. It's very flat in profile. So what happens is when you're wearing the watch, there is a big jump between these 2 points, and it looks a little bit unsightly. I don't enjoy it very much. And personally, once again, like I said in the Batman review, I do not like oyster bracelets on these styles of watches, but I'll get into that. Overall, the tolerances, once again, aren't very well done. Of course, the material, the milling is pretty good. The closure is good. I did say in the first part of the review that this section of the case, of the clasp, is very sharp to the touch, which is a bit of a problem. But functionality-wise, it's great, easy to wear. It's just not my cup of tea. Personally, I think this watch looks great on a Jubilee bracelet, and it was the main reason why I bought this watch was because I knew I wanted it on a Jubilee. But that's the general specifications. It's not very in your face. It's very subdued. The crown is not your standard oyster style crown. If we compare them side by side, you can see that the crown is a little bit flatter in profile, which is great. It makes wearability a lot nicer. It doesn't get in the way of your wrist when you're wearing it. So just overall, just look at the detail on the dial. It is stunning. They've really done well with that matte profile. And the numerals, as I thought the numerals would get in the way and it wouldn't be very nice visually to see, I've enjoyed the numerals where they're placed. Personally, I still prefer the idea of a fully loomed dial with a 9, 3, and 6 filled with luminova as well, but for this generation of model, I can understand why they did it. And if we go into the design history, which we will now, I'll explain why they did this. The subject on how the Explorer came to be, with Hillary and Norgay summiting Everest, is a tale as old as time, and it has been done to death. So I'm not going to read you the brochure about the history of the watch. Interesting, a lot of people make this mistake, but Tenzing Norgay was actually the person who wore the Explorer, where Hillary was wearing a Smith's designed watch, which was an England brand back in the day. So there's a little bit of trivia that's a little bit out of the way that people don't really mention, and I don't know why Tenzing Norgay doesn't get more attention. Anyway, that's irrelevant. Now, the Explorer design revolved around the 1016. That was the first time the Explorer really came out and showed the design that we are accustomed to seeing today. Came out in 36 millimeters. It's a beautiful watch with tritium patina, sits perfectly on the wrist, very comfortable, and that design has basically been used ever since. The next step was the 14270, which was introduced in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, or the late 80s, early 90s, and that was also a 36 millimeter configuration, just the same, but the biggest step was the jump from 36 to 39 millimeters, and that's when this case was introduced, this overall design. The 214270 was the first time they increased the size from 36 millimeters to 39, which was something they wanted to do to just increase the watch's overall presence and wearability, because a lot of people have bigger wrists nowadays and they needed to fatten up the size. It's quite a controversial point because a lot of people don't like the overall size of this watch. They find the presence a little bit jarring. And with this initial model, which was introduced at around 2010 and was used until 2016, before the model was updated to the fully luminova dial, the complaints that people had to do with the numerals. First off, the numerals being polished in the center, not all of them liked the idea that the 3, 6, and 9 were made out of solid white gold. The second complaint, which was a big one, was that the hands were too short for the watch. Essentially, Rolex took the 36mm style hands and fitted them into the 39mm case, and as you can see in this model, the hands don't reach the numerals in all the places, which doesn't bother me. I'm surprised, actually. I thought it would bother me, but it doesn't. What they have done since then with the newer models is increase the length and the size of the hands to give them better presence on the dial. But that's it in a nutshell. This model is a bit pivotal for the Rolex family because it was the increase from 36 to 39 millimeters, and a lot of people don't like the size of 39mm Explorers. But since I've never really handled one, I can't really tell you. I've handled a lot of Datejusts. I find Datejusts quite small. So this size, especially for its purpose, I can understand why the 39mm configuration was chosen. And let's talk about that. The major feature of this watch is by far its legibility, and that is the reason for this watch being the way it is laid out. It's more legible than any other watch in the Rolex lineup, I would say. If I compare it to the GMT, once again, you can tell the time from any angle with this watch. And compared to this, you have to take a little bit more time to look at it because you have a date window obstructing your view. You have all those details on the bezel. you have a second hand of the GMT hand, it's a little bit more difficult to tell the time. But with this and this increased size, it is so legible to see from any angle, any time of day. What I would do a lot of the time would be to place it on my desk, just in this configuration with the Jubilee bracelet, and leave it as a desk clock. I mean, you can see it from any angle in the room. It is stunning. So that increase in size helped the watch's overall legibility. And I think for a tool watch, that I think this watch really is, legibility is by far the most important detail that this watch covers so well. If we go into discussing the history a little bit more, we know that Ian Fleming wore a Rolex Explorer. And in his books, he never mentions what Rolex James Bond wears, but you can assume that he mentions the Explorer as the watch for James Bond. If it wasn't for Connery wearing the Submariner in the early film Dr. No, this might have become the quintessential James Bond watch, which I think is pretty good. This does, in my mind, fit James Bond's aesthetic when we talk about his character, his style. It's so understated, but it's so functional at the same time. It's such an appealing configuration, and the iconography of this dial layout really hasn't been lost over the years. So that's another fascinating little piece of trivia, and I think Rolex sales for the Explorer would be so high nowadays, they wouldn't be able to have them in stock if it was for this being used as the James Bond watch instead of the Submariner. So now you're probably asking yourself why I opted for the Jubilee. Well, simply put, a very simple dial, like this watch has, is just added boredom when you include an oyster bracelet to it. That's just my opinion. I don't think they work very well together because it is so plain and so simple, I probably would never wear the watch. The Jubilee, in my mind, I find a lot more comfortable, hence I wear them on practically every watch I own. But it adds that little level of visual complexity that makes the watch all the more appealing to look at. In my mind, when you look at the vintage 1016 on a Jubilee bracelet, it is just stunning. The layout, the complexity coupled with the simplicity, those minute tracks around the dial, it just looks stunning. So that's what I wanted to mirror. And along with that, I needed to brush the case. Of course, that was done. Brushing the case to get rid of the polished surfaces that were on the original Milgauss case design. But fitting this bracelet was not, I would say, an easy feat. And if you have any kind of mechanical knowledge, you can understand why. If you look at the thickness of the case relative to where the lug ends and where the spring bar sits, which is right through the center, you can see that the holes have been drilled very far up into the case. Now, if you had a solid end-link bracelet, it probably would be a lot easier to fit, but I personally prefer hollow end-link bracelets because of the way they can conform to the wrist. So to allow these end links to sit into the case, a little bit of modification had to be done. As you can see, they sit very well into the case as it is now. And I really like the idea of having this first link integrated into the case too without any constraint. And you'll notice that I haven't shown you the back of the watch because a little bit of modification had to be done to the back of the watch, and I shall now reveal the process. If any of you know, or if any of you followed this channel before, you might know that I modify my watches if I don't particularly like them, which is why I love spending such small amounts for these homage pieces. This is not for the squeamish, but I think it's the most tasteful case modification I've ever done to a watch because it doesn't ruin its overall aesthetic. It still looks just the way it is, but if you look at the back, this case has been tailor cut to fit the hollow end links. It wasn't a very easy feat. There were two options. The first option was to either cut the end links, the rounded section of the end links, to allow them to fit into the case. But then I thought it would ruin the rigidity of the end link. So the other option was to actually make a guided place for the end links to sit. So there is a small recession into the case, about, I would say, 3 millimeters deep, that allows for these end links to just fall into place. And fitting the bracelet onto the watch was probably the most satisfying experience ever, because generally when you're working with hollow end links or spring bars, there's a bit of a fight when it comes to fitting it in. But these just fell into place. And the best part is it doesn't ruin the aesthetic. When you take the bracelet off and you look at the case itself, there is no element of change to the overall aesthetic of the watch. I could easily fit a leather strap to this watch and wear it just the same without any impact on the case's rigidity and all the rest. So in my mind, I think it's quite a subtle improvement that allows you to fit this to the watch. And if you wanted to fit a hollow end link bracelet to the watch, you would have to do the same thing. And as you can see, it's all attributed to the thickness of the case itself. But with that, I can lead on to talking about the watch's movement. So let's do that now. This watch went through a baptism by fire on its first day. I've never treated a watch so poorly than this watch when it arrived. Immediately after the first part of the review, I took the watch off the oyster bracelet. I wore it on a leather strap for a day. While I was thinking about it, I then decided that it was now time to do this modification. So I wrapped the watch in duct tape, drew out the cutting points where these end links would fit, took a Dremel tool to it, and basically routed out these sections. Did not take the movement out of the watch. Left the movement running, left the watch the way it was. And what I can say simply is that the steel on these watches is very hard, extremely hard. Even with a new router bit, it took a good 5 minutes to make a substantial hole in either section of the case. But the movement itself, I thought this would be a good test. It would be a very good durability test to see just how much the movement can take. Because this router tool is spinning at thousands of RPMs. We're talking 8,000 to 10,000 RPMs very easily. And that impacts the mainspring, that impacts everything, the forks, it impacts the gears, the way everything meshes. Of course, there's heat and there's friction, so things would expand, the liquids and the oils inside would expand the watch. All the numerals, everything really got tested under those severe vibrations. And in the back of my mind while doing this, I thought to myself, well, hey, if the movement packs up, I will put an ETA 2824 inside it and continue wearing it. But after taking the watch out of its packaging after a day, the watch was fully wound, of course, because it had been spinning so much, the rotor had been active. The watch was still within 5 seconds of the time. It had gained 5 seconds after all of that, and there was not a thing out of place. And that is my conclusion to just how durable these movements are, and what kind of stresses they can be put under and still survive to tell the tale. I was so impressed, and I think my appreciation for the watch increased tenfold, knowing that this movement could take that level of impact. Something I wouldn't advise anyone to do. I'm a trained professional, as I'm sure you know, but it is incredible to experience a watch that is capable of taking that kind of impact and still function. And I mean, this is not an expensive watch. This watch cost me about £65 to buy. I know it's not a real Rolex Explorer, it's a sterile homage or a copy, whatever you want to say it is. But the movement inside it, which is your standard seagull movement with a date complication, takes a hit and still goes. Amazing. So that's the story I have behind the movement and its durability. And now it's time to see what this watch is like on the wrist. As you can see on a Jubilee bracelet, this watch really has a different feel to it. It feels a lot more classical in its overall aesthetic. And like I said, the case, though it is tall, doesn't impact wearability entirely. My wrist ranges around 6.7 to 7 inches on a good day, and that's because I don't go to the gym as much anymore, so my forearm has decreased in size, but the flat wrist bone presence doesn't change. So 7 inches is a good standard to follow. And you can see it just sits so comfortably on the wrist. The case is almost like a cushion case. With a Jubilee, it is just so comfortable. I cannot tell you how comfortable it is. You have to experience it yourselves. But it's just such a stunning everyday watch. You can look at it and just go, wow. It's so versatile, so wearable on a daily basis. It is a sporty dress watch to the end. And legibility, what this watch should be known for, it really is so legible. It's unreal. And just from a further distance away, you can see it doesn't look out of place. The 39mm size looks pretty large, but that presence adds to the watch's aesthetic. It's not trying to be so subtle that it's out of the way. It's a very good blend. It's an amalgamation of things. It's not subtle, but it's not in your face. It's present, but it's not out of the way, if that makes sense. After wearing this watch for just over 3 weeks, I can honestly say that my affection for it has increased so much. The first part of the review series, I received this watch and the Batman on the same day, and I was more drawn to wearing the Batman and talking about it than this. But really, there is a common trend that follows this watch, and I've noticed it with a lot of people who've bought the proper Rolex Explorer. is that you buy it and you sort of treat it just like a normal watch, a tool watch, something with a nice aesthetic, but nothing too overblown. After a few weeks of wearing it, you start getting it. You know, you get the idea that it is so basic, it's so understated. And then that affection just grows more and more to a point where you can appreciate this watch for everything that it is. The design layout, though plain and simple, has a nature to it that is solely its own, if that makes sense. And it really speaks to, once again, it speaks to Rolex's ability to create such an iconic model. I just enjoy it so much. And once again, the reason why I buy homage watches is that I can't necessarily justify spending so much for a steel watch. And at this stage in my life, I just want to wear watches and enjoy them. I love talking about them. It's just stunning. That's all I can say. My affection hasn't changed whatsoever. It has increased so much since I last reviewed this watch. And if you need any kind of assurance, trust me when I say that this watch will not let you down overall. You will not be disappointed by it. What I would suggest to anyone who's new and doesn't feel like doing the elaborate case modification like I did is to buy a solid end-link Jubilee bracelet to fit to the watch. The only reason, like I said, why I use hollow end links is that the watch conforms better to the wrist, in my opinion. But a solid end link bracelet will do just the same. You might even get a milled out clasp. As you can see, this is just your standard flat clasp. But that's all that's needed to be said about this watch. You won't be disappointed in buying it. I suggest you go for it right now, as soon as possible, because it is something you can wear on a daily basis, not look pretentious like anyone who wears some kind of Submariner or a GMT. It is so understated, but with that added touch of a Jubilee, turns it into something that is so useful and utilitarian. It's a perfect everyday watch. So thank you all for joining me in the second part of the 3-part review series. In the third part, closing thoughts, I'll bring together a few more ideas about the watch's wearability, how I've been enjoying it over a month period at least, maybe even 2 months. But what I can say is that this watch is not going anywhere. It is something to behold, something to enjoy, something to wear and not care about. It's just the perfect tool watch. To all my new subscribers, thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers for now.